Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Three Circle Church podcast Beyond the Weekend. And I am our host this week. My name is Jonathon. I'm the campus pastor from up at our Daphne location and have the honor of leading the congregation there and working with a fantastic team at that campus, and had the opportunity to speak this past week and share the message from Romans 6 that we're going to dive into today. And to be honest with you, I am thrilled and super excited because this week on the podcast, I have a person I've been looking forward to doing a podcast with. And one day when I grow up, I hope to have the depth of theology that this wonderful individual has. I'd like to introduce to y'all Kristi Sullins. I know she's been on the podcast before, but Kristi, thank you for teaming up with me to do this podcast.
I'm glad to be here, and I'm trying to decide if you just called me old when you said when you grow up.
Well, no, but you know
but
what?
That's okay. I receive it. I receive it as a compliment.
No. Listen, I always like to look for people that are a couple steps ahead of me and see what I can glean. And from you, the list is long. So
I appreciate that.
No, love you and Trey and what y'all do at Three Circle. I think we could spend an entire podcast just talking about how you guys contribute to what goes on around here. And I know you don't want any of that attention, any of that credibility, none of that. But just want to celebrate you and just thank you for what you bring to the table from just a wisdom and just being a presence. And then, you're so theologically solid that honestly, you're one of the people that I look at and go, man, I do want to be as theologically solid as you. So you encourage me and you push me in that way, and I love that.
Man, this is a great way to do a podcast. I feel great after this.
I told you I was looking forward to it. So now you know. But now that all the flattery's out of the way,
we'll have to kick Chris off the podcast more often.
That's right. Tell Chris to send some people in here, and I'll praise them.
There you go.
He does so good at that too, man.
He
really does.
He really does.
But no, listen, we were in Romans 6 this past week, and I know you heard Pastor Chris teach at the Fairhope campus. I was up at the Daphne campus teaching, and really, even in talking to Pastor Chris about the message and kind of dialoguing with you about that, there was this one part that I kind of zeroed in on. And so I'm going to tee it up by kind of sharing a story that I shared at the Daphne campus. And then I'd love to hear kind of some ways that you've seen God do some similar things in your life. But up at Daphne campus this past Sunday, I told the story about a pickup truck that I've had for years and years and years. I always joke that I've had this pickup truck in my life longer than I've had my wife in my life, which is a true story.
That's a good truck.
And it's a 2004 Ford F-150 that is dear to my heart because it's just been dependable and reliable. And every time I think that thing's going to quit on me, it doesn't. So, but anyway, I posted a picture recently at the Daphne campus, and we had done some new sign work out by the road. And I had used my truck to bring the lumber over that we were creating that sign with. And so I take this picture and I post it up on social media, and I didn't realize the truck is in the background of the photo. And so I unknowingly, just throw it up on social media, and a couple of my former youth group kids from back in the day, they see the tailgate of the truck in that picture. And they asked me, they're like, this truck is still kicking? Like, I can't believe this truck is still kicking. And I was like, oh yeah, man, it's still rolling. Like, as long as it's rolling, it's going to stay at the Duke house. We're going to use it. And I thought it was funny because I've had several students tell me, and that truck's been with me through different seasons of life. But one season in particular, I had to work maintenance for apartment complexes, and I did that full time to earn a living.
Just a handyman.
Oh yeah, I was a handyman, full-fledged, and so I did that full time, and then I was still doing ministry, as we call it, bivocationally, right?
Yes.
And so did that. And so anyway, through that profession of doing the maintenance man work, I would actually employ some of my youth group kids to go help me like paint apartments and do things like that.
A wise man.
And it worked out great. It was a win for them and it was a win for me. But they would have to ride with me in that pickup truck to like these locations where these apartment complexes were. And on those rides, we would talk about, you can just imagine, right?
Oh,
but
yeah.
a lot of times it was that unique opportunity for great conversation about what it looks like to follow Jesus, the struggle that comes along with that, how to be a man of God, as I was trying to figure that out myself and still am, but also trying to help these young men to figure out that same thing. And so anyway, I tell all that story to say, like one of those guys in particular, he said, man, you had such a huge impact on my life when you were riding around in that pickup truck and you would take us with you and you would just speak life into our lives. And so they always joke that truck, has significant value to them. And all of that kind of came to a head this past Sunday when I read in Romans 6 that Paul talks about, man, what God gives you, and especially parts of your body, parts of who you are, what makes you you, that you can make a decision that you can either use it for a weapon of unrighteousness or you can use it as a weapon for righteousness, a instrument, a tool, or a weapon for righteousness. And I went all in on that, and I kind of told the congregation, I said, man, it was amazing to me that God somehow figured out how to use an old pickup truck as a weapon of righteousness, that God figured out how to use an hour-long commute between point A to point B as a weapon of righteousness, that God has repeatedly in my life used the most unpredictable things at times as weapons of righteousness. And so, I know, Kristi, I shared a little bit of that story with you, but I know that you've seen it as well. God used things that you just would never expect as a weapon of righteousness. And so I'd love to hear anything you feel like you want to contribute about this idea of, man, God can use these things for his glory, and sometimes it's not even what you expect.
Well, I love the word weapon of righteousness. I had never heard that. So when you shared earlier that instead of instrument, it can be most closely translated as weapon.
Yeah.
Like, to me, that is an act of intention.
Yeah, right.
You don't haphazardly
Right.
use a weapon.
Right.
Like, it has an intention.
Right.
And so I love, first of all, that picture and that idea that and Paul's, I mean, he was a hands-on guy. He may have been the high scholar that we know he was, but you think about when he was writing all of his other epistles, they were churches that he had been hands-on in. And so in that picture, like, he is calling them to a union with Christ the same way
Right.
he lived out with them. And so when I think of, honestly, this past weekend, I can think of that one weapon of righteousness just top of my mind. So we were in Albuquerque.
Okay.
And I got to spend an afternoon with a young woman that I mentored for years. She and just a handful of friends may have been the hardest thing to leave in Albuquerque because that weapon of righteousness with her was literally a coffee cup.
Yeah.
And we
yeah.
showed up every week, whether it had been a long day, no matter what, we knew what we were going to do and when we were going to do it. And it wasn't this me teaching and her sitting there. Like, it was the conversation and living life together over a coffee cup that now I'm far away, but that is my phone. Like, now my phone becomes that weapon of righteousness because we're texting each other, or I will she's a mom of 2 littles and has gone through a season of some family issues, extended family issues. And so all I have to see is the text that says, do you have time for a phone call? And that becomes that weapon of righteousness. That for me goes both ways, because then in turn, she's speaking life back into me, calling me into maybe a more correct mindset and union with Christ. It's that beauty of that mentorship going both ways. Because I'm sure those guys that you, took along in your pickup impacted you. They may have not been.
No, 100%. Yeah.
And they may not have been preaching to you, and hopefully you weren't preaching to them on the way to the paint job. But I think it's that everyday act. When Paul's talking about that surrender with Christ and that union with Christ, we tend to make it really high and holy, whereas the real thing is union with Christ. It's that everyday act. It's that everyday surrender. It's that everyday living out of righteousness that is weaponized. Like, it is that intentional, defiant act of righteousness against a sinful core that we have.
Right. And just so the listeners are aware, so Romans 6, verse 12. So the ESV translation says, let not sin therefore reign in your mortal body to make you obey its passions. Do not present your members to sin as instruments for unrighteousness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and your members to God as instruments for righteousness. For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under the law, but under grace. And really that, again, going back to what Kristi alluded to, that word there for instruments, and it's so fun. That's why I love studying scriptures. Like, you can look at a few different
Yeah.
translations and you can go look at the original Greek language. And so what I did was I did a deep dive and I was like, man, that term instruments, other translations do translate it as weapon.
Right.
Why do they do that? Why do they use the word weapon? And when you look at the Greek term there, and forgive me, I can't remember it off the top of my
That's
head.
okay.
My Greek is a little rough these
You
days.
can wow us later with your
Yeah, yeah,
Greek.
yeah. I'll study those
Don't show
words.
off too much at one point.
And but when I did a deep dive on the Greek term used for that, it was literally an instrument or a tool used for warfare, which is a weapon.
That's a weapon.
And so, yeah, I think it's so powerful. And I think the other angle of that was helpful for me, just even as I studied scripture and was preparing to teach it, is this idea that we do have responsibility in our relationship to God, that we are responsible for making decisions and choices and being obedient, right? And so I think Paul does such this powerful thing, and we talked about it a lot, where in Romans 5, he is telling us what position we have, and we didn't do anything to earn that position, right?
Right.
That's all the work of Jesus. And in Romans 6, he's saying, well, but this is a process of you growing to become more and more Christ-like. And along the way, you've got to deal with sin in your life. He makes that clear in Romans 6. Sin's got to be dealt with. One of the things I said is what Paul says to be the treatment of sin is to treat it as if it's crucified with Christ, that your flesh has been crucified with Christ. That is a strong language to use in association to how do you deal with your sin. You deal with it severely, harshly, drastic
Almost
measures.
those violent measures to make sure
And
that it is dealt
it's
with.
right in line with what Jesus said. Jesus said, hey, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out, right? To remove parts of your life. And so that kind of harsh treatment with sin, and I think we have to be careful because we try to, we try to accommodate sin, coddle sin. I'll manage it, and Paul says, no, you got to kill it.
But do you think that's because we don't recognize the severity of it? Like that volatile of a response means it was that severe of an issue.
Yeah.
But I think often if it's not something that's getting us arrested or something that we're abusing that would get us in trouble, then we have a less, we just have an acceptance.
Well, I think it's twofold. I think it's 50%. What you just said, right? Oh, it's not that big.
Yeah, it's just not that big of a deal.
I think the other 50 is we overestimate our ability to manage it.
Oh, absolutely.
It's like, oh yeah, I mean, I don't really struggle with it.
I could put this down. I could stop.
Yeah.
It's not that.
Ben Kimsel, our worship leader up there, he had this phrase he said one day, and I thought, man, that's just so good. And he said, no, I'm not addicted. I can stop anytime I want, And he was just being funny, but it was a great point of saying like that can be our mentality is no, I can stop anytime I want, but we continue to do it. We continue to struggle. And you see that in so many different examples in people's lives, even in our own personal lives. We wrestle with sin and it's an ongoing battle.
Yeah.
And so Paul says, hey, you got to deal with sin by killing it. And then he says, as you continue to go forward, you have to make the decision, are you going to use what God has given you? Your personality, your body, your gifts, your even material possessions.
And your influence.
Your influence, you name it.
The life that you've been
given. Add to
given.
the list what God has given you. Are you going to use it for unrighteousness, which AKA sin? Or are you going to use it for righteousness? And I think that decision is so hard for some, and it's so hard depending on our mood and our feelings, stress.
But think about like what I was listening to you. What hit me was intentionality.
Yeah.
Like the Christian life is more than an intentional decision to accept Christ and then go about our business. Yeah. Like it takes you and I have had those days where it's not like be intentional in the morning. It's like, I'm going to be intentional in this moment before I say something.
Right.
That is it. But it is that idea that like you are presenting those instruments of warfare, those instruments of righteousness, like I'm intentionally choosing this.
Right.
And I'm going to keep doing it.
Right.
And I'm going to keep doing, not because this is what I want to do, because what I would really like to do is live in the flesh at this moment. And I think it can be, for me, easier to be lazy with those things.
Right.
And instead of that intentionality to go, what does it mean to be crucified with Christ today?
Right. Well, and Jesus says, take up your cross daily.
Yes.
So the week that we talked about that, I told him, I said, that's the mentality and the idea that every morning I wake up, there's going to be something today that needs to go to the cross.
Yeah.
Some part of my flesh, the sin nature that exists in me, I need to be willing to put it on the cross. And that is a reoccurring issue that we deal with every day. And I think the crazy thing is, God is convicted in my heart and in my life. I wake up every morning knowing Jonathon is a problem. You know what I'm saying?
I wake up every morning knowing Jonathan's a problem.
That's right. My wife would also echo that. She would echo that as well. Jonathon is a problem.
Jonathan is a problem.
In all seriousness, I look at that dude in the mirror and I go, he is a problem.
Oh,
you know? And so, hey, if it's me taking the reins here, it's probably going to go sideways really quickly. And so Lord, I need you, and just having that mentality, and I'm not perfect at it, don't get me wrong, but having that mentality when you start a day of saying, I'm not as Christ-like as I need to be. I'm not going to do everything right today. And Lord, the sin and the temptation is headed my way again today, and it will be tomorrow and the next day as well. And so, Lord, help me to see, A, what needs to die today, and B, what do you want me to use for your righteousness today? Help me to become aware of that. And so I know you don't struggle with any of that same stuff, right?
No, one thing that has in this series, I'm just going to ignore your sarcasm at that moment because that is a weapon of unrighteousness.
Oh, that's good. That's great theological application right there.
One of the things that has helped me in this series is, so I have verses all around my bathroom mirror, not because I am overly holy, but because I am desperately in need of the reminders.
Yes.
And Paul uses this picture of dying to sin, dying to self in so many of his letters. But in Galatians, when he is talking about how he has died to sin to live to righteousness, he adds this part at the end where he says, the life I live now, I live in the body. But he talks about, he gives a because. And I don't know, you have 2 young boys, and I remember mine being in that stage, and it was like, why? Why am I doing that?
Right.
And that has, as we have gone through Romans 5 and 6, that has been the answer to the why, is because at the end of that, it talks about because of Christ's love.
Yeah.
And so I think the legalistic part of me can go, I'm going to do this because this makes me right. This makes me holy. This keeps me out of trouble. But when I go to Galatians 2 and read this, I go, no, I'm supposed to be dying to sin, dying and taking up my cross because of his love.
Right.
Because he loved me enough to physically get on a cross for my sin. I need to be dying to sin because he did that.
Right.
And this pleases him, because I can lend more rules and legalism because it just makes sense in me. If I do this, then this. If I do this, then this.
Right.
And that takes the love out of the relationship.
Right.
But that's why that verse is hanging right there on the right-hand side. Why am I, because I don't know if you've ever experienced, but sometimes when you die to your rights, die to sin, you give up the opportunity to be right all the time. It can be very humbling.
Absolutely.
It can be humiliating. But it can be like, I want to respond this way. And I need the why to go, you're going to live in his righteousness because he already paid for it, because he loves you.
Right.
And that's why you're going to do this.
Right. Absolutely. And I love in Galatians 2, it also says, I think you spoke about a portion of that verse, but I told him on the week we talked about, your sin needs to die, your flesh needs to die, go to the cross. I said, Paul had this phrase that he used, and he wrote it in Galatians 2. He said, it is no longer I who live, it is Christ who lives in me. I said, so when people start going, what is going on with you? What's different? What has changed? Well, it's not me in charge anymore. I've surrendered. The in charge role now belongs to someone else, and it's Jesus. And I think so many people can get that kind of mixed up, and they think, oh, is that more rules and more legalistic? And I think you have to remember, Scripture teaches us that Jesus came so that we can have life and have abundant life, right?
Yeah.
And so you're not getting reprimanded and limited and restricted in a walk with Christ. You're actually being set free. And man, not to spoil anything, that's what's coming up this week, right?
That's right.
Um,
But think about if we know that Paul wrote this letter, Paul, who was a Pharisee, Paul, who knew the law, like he had lived out the burden of the law.
right.
And at that point with Christ, he was living out the freedom of, this sounds weird, but the surrender of his life. Like he had released that burden of the law when he chose to follow Christ. And so when he says this, I no longer, this is life, I no longer live, but it is Christ who lives
Right.
in me. In my mind, I can just picture him going,
Finally,
like it's,
finally, I'm free.
I'm free, hands in the
Oh,
air,
man, that's
going,
good. That's good.
But we think of, that surrender to the cross and to Christ and surrender to sin is a burden.
Right.
Well, no, really, the law and our own kind of broken attempt to it is the burden.
Well, and you know this as well. When I look back on my life personally,
Mhm.
the regrets are always tied to sin. Right? Always. And I don't mean this to sound braggadocious at all or anything like that, but I know you have several people that come to meet with you in midst of a mess and crisis and struggle. And again, in the role that I'm in, same thing. I've never had someone sit across from me and say, "Man, my life is a mess because I have been following Jesus."
Never once has that been.
I've never had it happen where someone's like, I've surrendered everything to Jesus and now I regret it and it's backfired on me.
Right.
It's the other way, right? It's I have chosen to use what God has given me for unrighteousness, and now I'm reaping the consequences of that.
Yeah.
And it's heartbreaking, and it's sad, and it's damaging. And it doesn't mean that God can't restore, redeem, and breathe life into those situations.
Absolutely.
But man, and it's like I try to tell people all the time. I'm like, man, I wish I could help you feel like, or feel what it's like to follow Jesus after you've done it for a year or 2 years or 5 years.
Right.
And how it feels and what it looks like in your family, what it looks like in your relationships. But I can't put that into you. I can't make you feel what that feels
Even
like.
that, and do you remember those times where you can just look in the mirror and there's no shame?
Mm.
Like when you know, not that you've been perfect,
Right.
but that you are actively trying faithfully to walk in
Right.
righteousness. So you're not worried about being caught
Right.
in anything.
Oh,
You're
yeah.
not worried about looking in the mirror and hating the person that you've become.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Like there is, what the world would tell us is bondage.
Right.
It literally is the freedom that lets you lay down and sleep at night without any worry, because you're not ashamed of yourself. You're not embarrassed. You're not afraid to
Oh,
be
yeah.
caught. Like it's this breath. It is just
That's-
it is just freedom.
It's funny that you said that word, because the language that I use to try to describe it is it's like you've been holding your breath underwater
Oh.
and you just reached the surface.
Yeah.
And you just learned what it feels like to get oxygen in your lungs. Like that life is available to you. That's the abundant life that
Right.
Jesus is talking about. Now, we're not going prosperity gospel where your bank account's
No.
going to go unlimited and,
We both have children. There's no unlimited bank account.
No. And,
But honestly, even that is all wasted idea of wealth,
Yeah,
because it all
right.
goes away.
right.
But the ability to pray and worship and to look at yourself in
And
the
to walk
mirror,
in freedom.
yes, and
In
to not carry that anxiety of what if somebody finds out, or what if
Right.
I mess this whole thing up.
Right.
Well, there's no price that can be put on that.
Right.
And that I feel like there are times that Paul in the different epistles wanted to like grab their shoulders and go, this is life.
Mm.
It is death to whatever empty option the world has around you, and it is the choice of life in Christ.
Right.
Like if you'll just trust me, if you'll just, like you said,
Hop on for the ride.
you can't explain it, but you can say, I promise, if you dig in,
Right.
you will know what I'm talking about. And sometimes I feel like Paul really kind of had that shoulder shaking moment. It was like, if you will just listen, because he says it over and
Oh,
over
yeah.
again. But what that tells us is this has been a problem from the early
From the
church
start, yeah.
to now, because we see life through our own lens of desire.
Right, and I don't ever wanna create the impression that this is, an old message for us. This is a message we have to speak into our lives repeatedly.
Well,
Like,
what'd you
man,
say? Die every day. Every
yes,
day you're picking up
absolutely.
that cross.
I mean, walking through Romans 5 and 6 like we've been over the past few weeks has spoken into my heart and my life
Yes.
just as much as it did years ago when I read it for the first time, because that's a work that God is always doing, reminding us of our position because of what Jesus did.
Yeah.
We always need to be reminded of that, and reminding of what the opportunities are if we will surrender to Christ fully more and more every day. Man, that's what we need. We need that reminder all the time. And so it doesn't matter if that's day one for you in surrendering to Christ and giving your life to Him, or if you've been doing it for decades. It's a message that breathes as much life into us, no matter when you've heard it and for how many times you've heard it. And so, man, church family, we hope that just us kind of kicking back and forth this morning and talking about what God has been working in our heart as we've read the scriptures, I hope it's been an encouragement to you. Kristi, thank you so much again for being here and teaming up
Great
with me.
conversation.
And church family, we hope that you will look around you, see what God has given you, and how can you use those things as weapons of righteousness for His glory. Consider that, and we hope this has been an encouragement to you. Have a great week.